Welcome to another edition of Business Today, where we discuss in depth the business world and its dealings. As always, we've got two very exciting segments lined up for you. And first up, as always, it is the personality segment. Now today for our personality, we are looking at a very interesting person who is affiliated with the TRC, better known as the Telecommunications Regulation of Commission of Sri Lanka. Now, again, Telecommunication Regulation of Sri Lanka. We brought on the Director General of the TRC here to our studio. Let's learn a little bit about him.
Mr.Oshada Senanayake is the current Director General of the Telecommunication Regulation Commission of Sri Lanka. A visionary business and information technology professional turned entrepreneur with over 15 years of experience in corporate management, strategy implementation, business analysis, process optimization, software development, and delivery management with exposure in working across multicultural environments and countries including Sri Lanka, United States, and United Kingdom. He is a past pupil of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia. He has followed Master in Business Administration from the Australian Institute of Business, Adelaide, Australia. He was the former CEO and Director of Enfound Holdings Private Limited, Director, Circle Ceylon Holdings Private Limited, Director Consultant for BNI USA for Sri Lanka, Principal Consultant, Trade IT Global Australia, Panelist at the Bombay Stock Exchange and India Institute of Directors Forum, Mumbai in the year 2018, Panelist at the National IT Conference in the year 2018.
Mr. Oshada Senanayake, the Director General of the Telecommunication Regulatory Commission, is here with us. Great to have you on.
Good to be here, Win.
And of course, we're talking about the TRC right now.
Yep.
So it's only right we start off. I mean, people have an idea what the body does, but what exactly is the purpose and the vision behind the TRC?
Right, so just to give a quick perspective on the Telecommunication Regulatory Commission, as the name says, we are entrusted with regulating all aspects of telecommunication in Sri Lanka. So anything that's got to do with utilization of a spectrum now, for any country, a spectrum, a radio spectrum is a very, very important digital asset. So we are the placeholders, right? We are the gatekeepers in making sure that spectrum is used prudently. And also moving on to the media institutions like you all, there are two sides to it. One aspect is the system licensing that we manage, and then the media ministry looks at the content side of it. So in a gist of things, I mean, we moderate and regulate all aspects of telecommunications within Sri Lanka. But however, we have managed to act, which has been enacted in 1991, right, which is years back, as you know, Ben, right? So we are looking at progressing forward and making sure the right changes are made in making sure that our regulatory aspects are current.
And of course, now you're talking about the policies from 1991. In your view, how has the industry shifted? Right now, we see the advent of the internet happen after that. And of course now social media platforms. So how has the landscape shifted in the telecommunications industry from 1991?
Right, so if you look at the Sri Lankan context, I mean, we moved on, telecommunications moved on from a fixed perspective into mobile, right? I mean, that has been the first step towards convergence. We are right now looking at further convergence in terms of mobile operators, or even for that matter, fixed operators moving into different adjacent verticals. For example, direct-to-home broadband, direct-to-home dish TV services. So the Regulatory Commission's landscape has changed in terms of looking at these different perspectives that has come into the foray in changing of technology. So that's why it's very important that we look at the current framework to make sure it's quite concise and kind of to make sure we cover all these aspects. For example, as we go along, the fixed and the mobile aspects has converged together, So there are certain aspects we need to look at it in a progressive manner. And I mean, that's imperative that's in front of us right now to make sure. When we are looking at IoTs, we are looking at 4Gs, we are looking at currently 5G. In fact, early on today, we have just relaunched the 5G trial runs in Sri Lanka, which is a major stride in moving forward in the digitalization of Sri Lanka. So these are aspects that we are looking at from a perspective of TRC.
Now, talking about TRC, I mean, you actually mentioned a very interesting initiative, the 5G. So what are the new initiatives looks like, and can you elaborate a little bit about the 5G technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the current context, I mean, we've been talking a lot about digitalization. So there are three aspects of digitalization, digitalization, right, in terms of digital transformation of a country, right? So digitalization, and digital transformation is three phases, right? So if you look at 5G, if I go into a bit of technicalities, the throughput is quite different to what 4G offers, for example. The latency time, I'll give you an example from a very layman's terms of view. If you take the latency of a particular 4G technology, it's about 200 milliseconds. In 5G, we are talking about 1 millisecond. So if you are looking at smart traffic lighting systems, if you are looking at smart health systems, you need these latency times to come down, right? So if you look at the reaction time of a human, we are looking at about 230 milliseconds, for example, right? If you train yourself, it will come down to 200 milliseconds. So in 5G, we are talking about 1 millisecond, right? So and on a different aspect, it will consume much more less power in transmission, right? So that's where 5G is coming into the foray, and we are not talking only about the consumer side of things. We are talking about the revolution of industries. We are talking about the Internet of Things coming on board. So the underlying technology is going to be 5G for all of these. Now we can come back and argue on a different aspect of health issues and all that's coming into play as well. But these are matters that has to be progressively looked at as well.
And of course, with the advent of technologies such as 5G, of course, there will be things like decentralization, privacy issues that are actually challenges in the future. Right now, with the current systems in the current industry, what are the challenges the TRC is facing?
See, if you look at the current context, again, the technological evolvement requires certain changes in the framework. Now, let's take again the case in point of 4G and 5G, for example, right? If you take 2Gs, the 3Gs, the 4Gs, I'll give you an example. If you look at the infrastructure that's required, we've heard about the tower systems that's in place. Now, when you take 5G, the context has changed, because you need to have towers in close proximity, the base stations, which requires then, for example, can we go and basically erect traditional towers? Absolutely not, right? So there has to be legislation coming in to take on passive infrastructure, as we call it. Even a lamp post or a light post we can use for 5G transmissions, right? So we need to have legislation and the protocols in place so that this passive infrastructure could be enabled. Now there are certain things called the right of ways, right? The cabling coming in. So how do you define this? How do you moderate these sort of aspects coming through? You cannot allow unmoderated implementation, right? There are certain aspects that you need to look at from an environmental perspective. So these are aspects you need to seriously look at when we move on. And as I mentioned, the spectrum is a very critical part of any sort of technology. So even on 5G, we are looking at the proper usage of spectrum. So we are looking at candidates. So if you take 5G, there are candidate bands. So 2.6 gigahertz, for example, or 3.5 gigahertz. So right now the trials are going on the 3.5 gigahertz band. But again, once you move out of the trials, you need to have a certain transparent methodology where you are equitable in giving these allocations of spaces for mobile operators equitably, right? Not equally, equitably, depending on the customer base they have, the amount of data that they transmit. So all these factors has to be taken in.
Yeah, so fair usage probably.
Fair usage, and these are the challenges we face right now, Vin. I mean, it's been, I would say, over the years, this process has evolved. So we need to bring in international expertise from the likes of ITU. So ITU is International Telecommunication Union. So that's the apex body where they define different standards that's required to moderate these sort of aspects. So we are looking at the technology transfer towards us and understand the best practices, that we don't reinvent the wheel at the end of the day. We take out the best practices and move on as a country.
And of course, you answer them in certain ways as well. So apart from the ITU, what are the international bodies or the local bodies you have to collaborate most frequently with?
So the local bodies, for example, if you look at the tower erections and all of that, right, what's important is the local bodies, the local governing bodies, The conundrum we have is, as much as we are looking at expanded coverage, there's an inhibition by consumers or citizens of a tower coming up, So there are certain aspects we need to look at, right? The Urban Development Authority, approvals and all of that coming into place, So those are the aspects we are looking at in making sure that we moderate all these aspects. I just got a call yesterday from the east, from a particular local body saying that the particular area of people are complaining about erection of a tower, where we had to explain as long as they have the approvals in place. I mean, there are certain practices we adhere as a TRCSS as well. All of these towers has to have its own lightning arresting systems and all of that particular best practices that we've very clearly defined on the licensing. Right. So I mean, these are things that we will work very closely, and we do work with right now with local government bodies.
Being a regulatory commission, you adhere to your own regulations as well, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's where the compliance comes in, right? So we have a separate compliance body and an internal auditing system in place as well. As much as we define these protocol and frameworks and regulations, we need to ensure that certain entities are meeting these requirements. So one aspect is providing them the required licensing, but then again the compliance is imperative as well. We need to make sure there are compliance across the board. So these are things that we are continuously improving ourselves on, I would say.
And of course, with the expansion of the industry right now, with it going to the internet and of course maybe the digitalization of telecommunications in the sense of television and all that stuff, there'll be a lot of new players coming in, and of course the people that you have to regulate, the private bodies you'll have to regulate will expand. So what is the framework, or what is the plan for that?
So very good question, Uvain. So I mean, there's going to be new players coming into the market. I mean, it's a common phenomena, even in business. But what's important is the due diligence that we conduct to make sure that we moderate these entities that want to be part of the market. So we have a couple of setups that we put in place to make sure that we moderate this. One aspect is, as I mentioned, although it's a 1991 Act, in 1996 it was amended to basically have an entity called the Commission, which is literally a director board, right? So any entity that comes in right now, the due diligence will be done within the working layers of TRCSL, but however the final decisions would go into this Commission. It literally is a director board, right? And there are certain aspects that we look at. I mean, for example, if it's a new player coming in, we look at their financial due diligence, their capacity of investment, right? Now, again, I come back to the whole point of the spectrum. We don't want entities coming in and basically utilizing the spectrum and then taking up a spectrum and basically idling with it, because it's a precious piece of digital asset, right? So what we do right now is we set very, very precise KPIs, even for new operators, that what we require them to do. So just as much as they get a licensing, it doesn't mean that they can just take a piece of spectrum and just be there not utilizing it, right? So there are certain KPIs they have to report back, right? So I mean, these are aspects we are looking at, both from a mobile aspect as well as even the media institutions. So for example, the media technology is evolving as well. So one aspect is the free-to-air terrestrial services. Then we got the direct-to-home, direct-to-home pay TVs. So I mean, all these aspects are governed separately. So the licensing is different. So we've got different licensing. So Section 22 covers spectrum licensing. Section 17 covers system licensing, for example. So as I mentioned, the media institution should get a System 17 license from us. They shouldn't stop there. They have to go to the media ministry and then get a content license, for example. Right?
So the content license is completely separate.
It's completely different, right? So we don't have a mandate of moderating content, right? We are mandated in providing the infrastructure licensing, right? The content licensing has to be done by the media ministry, for example, right? So that's where, but however, there has to be cohesion right now. There has to be some sort of composite mechanism to make sure that we converge on these issues. Because there's a lot of content issues coming through as well, content moderation is a big issue. I mean, right now with the internet coming through and then the 4Gs to the fast-paced broadband coming in, there's a lot of content generated online. So the conundrum is right now who moderates these aspects.
The information that's shared.
Exactly. So
And of course, going into your experiences now, of course, you've been appointed the Director General in last November. So what has your experience been like, and what were your thoughts coming into this regulatory body, actually being outsider or looking in?
Right. So, I mean, I'm from a technology background, for example, right? I mean, I was looking at a vision of pretty much digitalization, the services of Sri Lanka, completely digitally transforming Sri Lanka. I mean, looking at the economy, even to basically fuel the economy through a digitalized approach to it. So, when you look at TRCSL, I mean, it's a very, very strategic entity which will govern the infrastructure that is required for this digitalization process, if I may, so the digital transformation of the country, right? I mean, if you look at the broadband aspects of it, even if you look at the media aspect of it, these are aspects we are looking at. So, for example, Internet of Things is going to play a critical part in the future. Even the knowledge-based economy we are talking about, right? The services-based industry for IT, the underlying front for all of this is technology infrastructure, the connectivity, right? And that's where TRC comes into play, and that's where I believe we can play a serious role. And I think we have a huge role to play in the digitalization in terms of the country.
And now looking at that avenue, what are the financial burdens that we are looking forward towards? And what are, of course, looking at financials, we'll have to actually look at the revenues as well. So what are the revenue streams that will be available?
So if you look at TRCSL, it's one of the revenue generating entities for the government. So if you look at the past year, TRCSL has generated over 17 billion rupees to the treasury, right? So I think that's one of the key aspects of TRCSL, where we could contribute a lot to the treasury, which could be reused for the potential use of this digitalization. Now, when I talk about digitalization, coverage is imperative again. As much as we talk about the highest levels of utilization of mobile usage in Sri Lanka, for example, we are still struggling with about 2,000 blind spots where even 2G services are not available. So as much as we talk about providing access to these digital services for citizens, it's imperative again that we look at a uniform coverage of internet. So that's one key aspect we are looking at. I mean, there are certain aspects of funds which we can reuse and reinvest on the industry as well, which we are looking at right now. I'm looking at very aggressively this year. As much as we compel or drive the operators to provide coverage, it's I think it's important that TRCSL also contributes and invests back. So there are certain avenues as per the Telecommunication Act that governs the TRCSL, where we can certainly do that as well. So in terms of revenue, to answer your question, yes, so we generate a lot of revenue for the government, and I think we will continue to do so.
And of course, now moving away from the regulatory commission to the industry itself, because you have a technological background now, you mentioned the Internet of Things, which means smart devices, and of course different levels of privacy coming in terms of blockchain and all that stuff. So things will be a little bit hard to enter. But what, in your view, will be the landscape of the industry, say 10 years from now?
See, you made a good point about security aspects as well, as much as we go along the technology lines. Now, if we take 5G and the Internet of Things, all aspects of our lives are going to be interconnected. I mean, from a smart TV point to pretty much your smart home systems. If there's intrusion, right, I mean, literally your complete household systems, including your car, could be literally controlled. We're talking about also network equipment that could be penetrated in terms of 5G. So while it's not an ideal thing not to be digitalized, something that protects us without being digitalized is the fact that, you know, that scenario where there's so much you can penetrate from a security perspective, a cyber security perspective. But as much as you keep going along this digitalization process, you need to have that protocol to make sure you're protected. So this is one aspect also we are looking at. In fact, I'm sitting on the board of the SLCERT, the apex body of cybersecurity in Sri Lanka. So as much as we talk about the IoTs, the 5Gs and all of that, we are right now also looking at bringing in these aspects of certification, the cybersecurity certification even for the telco industry. It will govern the way core networking systems is going to be utilized. It's going to govern the way citizens are protected in terms of utilizing the network equipment that they connect to the internet. So there's a lot of other deep dives that we need to look at, as you mentioned. So that's one key area which we are going to collaborate with a lot of other different agencies like the SLCERT. We have the ICTA, which is going to drive the complete digitalization roadmap for Sri Lanka. So I think, to answer your question, TRC is going to work in close cohesion with all of these entities in making sure we bring in these aspects into play as well.
Yeah.
And I think from a country's national security perspective also, these are aspects we need to look at very seriously.
And of course, now again coming back to the TRC, what is the next immediate plans? Now, of course, you mentioned 5G, but apart from that, for television, for radio broadcasting, what are the next immediate plans?
Right, okay, so very good question again. So if you look at the current analog systems, right, for example, the current context, I'll give you the stark situation right now. If you look at our 700 megahertz spectrum where we have this free-to-air TV transmissions, for example, it's literally full up, right? If you look at our FM channel stations, right, the FM channel spectrum is literally full up. But how do we now address this situation, right? The only way to address this situation is digitalization. So from a point of view of FM stations, it's digital audio broadcasting we need to introduce. But from a perspective of terrestrial TV, it's a digital video broadcasting right now which we are looking at. So there are certain different technological aspects we need to consider again that we have initiated right now. So that digitalization of the FM stations and as well as the TV stations is an imperative for us right now. It's on the priority list for us. That's one aspect of it. And from a mobile and a broadband perspective, internet penetration, we are looking at 4G coverage. By 2020, we have a concept called the Government Senanayake, which we have made a clear-cut KPI, although it's about 2.5 months since it started. By 2020 December, we are looking at clearing all the blind spots. So that's another angle we are looking at. But from a consumer's perspective, TRC SL is going through a digitalization process as well. For example, one of the most common things that people walk into TRC SL is when they lose a mobile. Right?
Okay.
Right now, within the 2 months, with the help, of course, with Sri Lanka police, we've completely digitalized that process. So anyone can right now go to ineed.police.lk, and even without walking into a police station right now, can lodge their IMEI number and make sure that we can find their mobile phone.
Yeah.
Of course, those phones has to be registered with the IMEI number with TRC SL on that front. So there are certain aspects we are looking at. Right now, today, although it should have been done earlier, we have just enabled the card transactions as phase 1. So up until yesterday, people had to come with cash.
Yeah.
So from today onwards, we pretty much basically enabled cashless transactions, right? So there are a lot of aspects we are looking at digitalization from a consumer perspective as well.
Being consumer friendly, I guess.
Consumer friendly with the utilization of technology. You know, as much as we are the regulator, I think we need to embrace technology as well in making sure we give a better service to the consumers as well.
And of course, talking about changes, now you mentioned the 91 policy acts that are in place. Are there new policies that are being looked at?
Yes, absolutely. So we are looking at a amendment to the act right now. It's been in progress from about 2013. Now the conundrum we have again is that it's already 7 years past, right? So we are looking at initiating the process to make sure that we look at that from a current context. We are looking at bringing in that again, as I mentioned, the best practices from IT use and localizing it. There are local aspects that you need to bring on to these acts. So one key aspect is the convergence of technologies, as I mentioned, the fixed lines, the mobiles. We need to look at new casting websites, who moderates what. Everyone has to take responsibility in content that they put out, like as much as you all do, right? So these aspects are right now not covered in that act. So there's a certain process it has to go through. You know, it has to go through the legal draftsman, the AG's department. So the process is in play, and then it'll take time, but we are looking at expediting it. So that's one of the most important priority tasks for us as well, to make sure that we update the act to make sure that we have sufficient mandate to cover aspects we are supposed to cover right now in the current context.
Yeah, and of course, now looking towards the future, the way future, we will see that multinational companies coming into our orbit as well, because as internet or the telecommunication moves towards the future, there will be broadband facilities that will be available worldwide. So what are the plans or steps in play for Sri Lankan TRC and Sri Lankan industry to make sure that we are on par with the world standards?
Again, a very, very good question. Right now, if you look at the internationalization, I mean, if you look at the current trends that's on the hype cycle, on the top of the hype cycle, I think it's a matter of keeping up to date and being part of these initiatives. So as I said, the ITUs, the GSMs, the APUs, we need to have a very sound research arm, right, that will make sure that there's knowledge transfer that comes in, and the adoption. That's very important. As much as we research, it goes so long as the adoption is the key, right? So we are looking at all these aspects from that perspective. So to answer your question again, it depends on the intent from a government perspective as well as from a regulatory perspective from our end. So I think the intent is there right now, Ovin. It's a matter of executing. So as I mentioned, the complete digitalization process has started. I mean, the Lotus Tower also comes under us. I mean, it's got its antenna mast that is all geared for digital broadcasting. So it's a matter of putting in that operational procedures, right, to make sure that we leverage on the assets we have right now.
And that's the way it should be. And of course, going forward, as we wind up the segment, is there a message you want to communicate about the TRC or the initiatives you've planned out to our viewers?
Absolutely. I think the TRC is changing its role as well to be more conducive and more open towards its clientele and the citizens. So if you go onto our website, we are in the process of updating it as well, but there's a lot of services that you can consume. I mean, if there's any issue that you need to raise up, there are different procedures that we've opened up. We've just opened up our digital channels as well, so anybody can come on even Facebook or Twitter and basically respond to us on our Twitter handle as well. So any sort of issue that they may have in terms of a service by a mobile operator or a broadband operator for that matter.
Complaints,
or I mean, there's a separate unit that's looking at that onto that on a very serious note right now, and we've got it on a workflow system and it's all moderated. So I mean, that's one aspect we would encourage all our citizens to utilize and reach out to TRCSL, and we are there to help.
Mr. Oshada Senanayake, thank you for joining us. That was a very informative segment.
Likewise.
All right, with that, we'll wind up the personalized segment. We do have a market discussion segment coming right up, so don't go anywhere. Stay tuned in. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Business Today. We are moving on to our market discussion segment right now. And today, for the market discussion segment, we're actually going to be focusing on the equity markets and, of course, the effects and the trends that will follow, and, of course, what's happening right now. To do this, we brought on an industry insider. We brought on Mr. Kavinda Pereira. He's the head of research at Asia Securities Private Limited. He's here with us. Thank you for joining us, Kavinda.
Thank you for having me here.
Kavinda, to start off, now, the equity market, there have been a little bit of changes. There have been activity after the election, but right now it's kind of muted. So what is currently the situation there?
The equities actually saw a strong rally towards the end of 2019, and this was actually mainly driven by the political stability that we saw after the elections, and the positive business sentiment and the consumer sentiment that we saw. And with this rally, there was the ASPI, the All Share Price Index, actually moved up to 6,200 levels, and the valuations picked up along with it to 11.9 times price to earnings, which was pretty much in line with the 5-year average that it was trading at. Again, with the tax cuts that were implemented in November of last year, we saw the market gaining some more momentum, and this actually gave a boost to the equity markets because there was wide expectation that the corporates will benefit from this, and also the consumers will drive more business towards the corporates. What happened in January was largely two rating agencies, Fitch and S&P, actually initiated a downgrade of the outlook for Sri Lanka while keeping the rating intact. So this actually created a bit of concern for the foreign investors, especially the investors that follow these ratings closely. There was concern if the tax cuts were too steep and whether they could be sustained. And this was actually one of the reasons why the foreign investors decided to stay away from the markets. And that led to the soft momentum that you asked me about, and that's what we see right now.
And historically, around the world, before election, it does tend to slow down and people are hesitant to invest. We will see this current trend, I believe, until April.
Yes, that is what we are expecting as well, because obviously there's a lot of policy that will be determined after the election, when the government is formed, when the new the ministers and when the new cabinet is formed. So this is one of the main reasons why there is a bit of a slowdown before. But this again is the opportunity that the investors have to position in counters that are relatively undervalued but fundamentally strong.
Yeah, and of course, talking about the policies that are coming in, there was a budget that was introduced after the election, and there were proposed tax cuts that were introduced actually. So what have you seen as the impacts of these tax cuts being in the corporate world?
So the tax cuts, I look at it from two angles actually. First is obviously from a consumer side. If you look at the initiatives that were proposed in November, the first component was removal of the NBT, reduction of VAT from 15% to 8%. Both those are consumer taxes, and the reduction of that will actually help reduce some of the consumer prices in the market. And this has an impact for all of us as consumers, where we'll see the price levels of some of the consumer goods staples coming down. This increases affordability and drives more consumer spending. On the other hand, we saw the reduction of corporate taxes, reduction of income taxes. Personal income taxes, the threshold for tax-free threshold was increased to 250,000 from 100,000 before. And the maximum tax bracket, the threshold was brought down from 24% to 18%. So all those factors combined, we see more disposable income in the consumer's hand. And this leads to, again, more consumption and, again, volume growth for the corporates. And on the other hand, you also see there is a consumer sentiment factor, which is more of a psychological impact, where when there is better economic growth expected, consumers tend to spend more looking at the prospective income. So this is again another factor that we see as a positive coming from the tax cuts, which will lead to overall corporates seeing better volume. Another factor that we need to look at is for banks. With interest rates coming down and being maintained at a relatively low level, we think that there will be more demand for credit, because last year in 2019 you saw the private sector credit come down quite significantly. The growth was about 4%, 4.5%, which was very, very low compared to our previous years. And this is again, when with more affordability, with more disposable income, we can expect the credit demand to increase as well, especially from the retail side, where people have more income on their hands.
Also, the export industry was also saw some changes in the tax cuts, right?
That's right. Exports, as in more on the manufacturing side, where you saw the manufacturing industries, their taxes were reduced from 28% to 18%, which was again a positive move for the corporates. And that is, that's the second part that I would look at, the corporate tax component, where you see very key industries like banking, insurance, their taxes came down from 28% to 24%, which is again adding to the profitability of these businesses. And manufacturing, as I said, the taxes were reduced. There were concessions offered to the tourism industry, hotel operators. All these on a corporate side, this will add to the profit pool, which will improve the return on equity that these companies will be able to post.
And of course, now looking at those positives, right now you mentioned that the two rating agencies, S&P and Fitch, actually categorize us as a little bit of a risky investment. So what are the macroeconomic conditions that actually led to this particular scenario?
If you look at, the real core of this issue, where this stemmed from, was mainly the expectation that the tax revenues will come down, which is a given outcome. When you look at the tax breaks that were offered in two stages, November and some in January. But here again, we see that the government can take a bit more of an active role in coming out to the market with a medium-term fiscal management plan, because that is where the information vacuum is, that is where the gap is. That's where analysts make different assumptions in terms of the tax loss, and that is what's driving the rating agency's view. So if this information gap could be closed and the government could come out and actually present a more medium-term fiscal management policy, that is a key positive that we see for the investment community as well as the country's rating as a whole. And another factor to consider is we are still under the IMF program, and the next review will happen in March or April. So when that happens, and the outcome of that will also feed into certain rating agencies' actions as well. Especially, we have not seen a rating action from Moody's yet, even though Fitch and S&P have downgraded us.
Yeah.
But this actually is going to be another key factor that investors will watch.
And of course, those are the three big rating agencies that
Yes,
are in play. And now you mentioned the IMF review is due in March or April. Of course, the election is going to take place and the results will be announced somewhere in April as well. So what do you think will be the trend going forward towards the foreign, in terms of foreign investors' curiosity in the Sri Lankan markets?
So foreign investors, if you look at the numbers, especially on the equity side, there has been foreign outflow of about 3.2 billion rupees in the first month alone. And as I said earlier, this was mainly due to the rating actions, which created a slightly negative outlook. But also because of the election year, where investors tend to stay away from these markets, and also you have to one of the key things that we see is that investors who are seasoned, relatively used to the Sri Lankan markets, and who have been investing in Sri Lanka for some time, have actually taken this opportunity to take up positions in very strong counters. And this is actually one area that we see. On a broader level, if you look at foreign investors, they have more options where they can pool their money into. So they don't need to be restricted to Sri Lanka. So that is why on a broader scale, foreign investors stay away. But the more seasoned investors understand the opportunity. The valuation levels are very cheap. So that is where they try to get in at this stage. Talking about foreign investors, one of the key things that we also have to watch is the bond market. Even though we're talking about equities here, the inflows into bond markets acts as a precursor to equity markets. If you look at the historical trend, generally bond market flows tend to come in to a market faster than an equity market's flow. It's called, that's true for all markets. It's called bond flows are generally more fluid capital, and it moves in and out of a country depending on the risk factors. And if we look at the bond markets, we've seen a positive development there. There's been an inflow for the first month so far, and this again, this is an activity that we need to track, especially with the rate cuts that have been announced. There was an outflow last week after the rate cut, but overall for the first month we've seen a positive development here, and we think that with the elections coming to an end, conclusion of it, and all the policy stability coming into play, we think it provides a good opportunity for the foreign investors to look at Sri Lanka more favorably again, the valuations being where they are.
In that point, what sectors have been doing well, particularly in the equity market, and what sectors have been declining?
I wouldn't say declining per se.
Yeah.
It's
mostly
So almost all the sectors that we look at, the larger sectors, have a very positive outlook, especially coming from the more positive demand conditions that we see in the market. But if you look at it from a market perspective, the pricing and the valuation perspective, sectors that are yet to come up to the potential are banks, conglomerates, the large cap sectors, and that is mainly because there's significant foreign holding in these companies, and as I said, they've stayed away, so there's not much movement there. So that is where I would say the larger potential is.
Now, of course, in Sri Lanka, you do find unexpected at every corner now, because there are tragic incidents that happen, there are weather-related incidents, there are human-driven incidents that happen. Now, of course, very lately there has been the coronavirus that has been transiting. So, how does the equity market really adjust itself according to those conditions? And of course, has it changed? And of course, we've experienced some drastic drops due to some unfortunate situations last year.
Yeah.
So how has the situation or the policies adjusted in that lieu?
So let me take the first part of that question. If you look at markets, they and events like this, you look at there is several ways that markets react. First is obviously the first stage of that is where there is a lot of panic setting in. There's very little information at the beginning. There's no real reasons as to why this is spreading and how it's spreading. So all that contribute to a lot of panic in the marketplace. So that is where you see the valuations coming down. And if you look at the Asian markets, especially last week, you saw the same situation. There was selling in the markets. All the markets were down. Then what you see is a few months later, when the situation stabilizes slightly, you get into that stage, relatively stable conditions, where it's identified, the causes are identified, the way it's spread is identified, and the measures have been taken. So that is where you'd see a bit more calm return to the markets, and then followed by the more recovery stage, if you will, when the situation is under control and new cases are slightly reducing. So we are currently at the earlier stage of this, very early stages here, and the markets have actually reacted in that way. And you see that especially when you look at certain markets like commodities, where the prices have actually come down quite significantly. Industrial commodities like copper have come down by about 11%, 12% in the first month alone, because of a fear of a slowdown, because China is a large manufacturing hub, and when China slows down, there's obviously a drop in the prices. And importantly for us, the oil prices have also come down about 18% from the beginning of this year until now. So this means that oil especially is a positive for us, because we are a net oil importer. And also the second factor is we depend a lot on oil in the next few months. We will, especially given the dry season that's coming up and the power generation requirement.
Yeah, when you say that, I mean, with the facts and figures, the speculation also drives the industry to a certain extent. Kavinda Pereira, thank you for joining us. It was a great pleasure to have you. That was the Head of Research at Asia Securities Private Limited. And with that, we will wind up today's edition of Business Today. Thank you for joining us. Do join us next time. Till then, good night.